Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila with another story for you. Our story today is called Lost in the Cornfield. Well, it was 1939 and it was fall, and all the farmers there in Missouri raised corn, and the corn was all big and tall with ears on it. Johnny, who was 2 years old, and his mom and dad lived on their very own farm. And behind the house, beside the barn, was a big cornfield. Now, I know all of you boys and girls that are sons of farmers, your fields may go for acres and acres and acres. But this wasn't quite that big of a cornfield, but it was quite big in that you could stand in the rows and it would be as far as you could see. Well, one day, Mommy had little 2-year-old Johnny, and she had put him outside in the yard. Now, they lived way far away from everybody else, like most farms were then, and Mommy and Daddy felt it was a very safe place for little Johnny to play in their yard, and being only 2, they didn't think that he could get out of the gate. So Mommy put him out in the yard to let him play. Well, she was just going to be in the kitchen canning peaches. So she was standing in the window and she could look up and see him toddling about, looking under the bushes and peeking in the doghouse and doing things. He was just having fun like any other little boy. Well, pretty soon she got really busy cutting up those peaches and putting them in the jars. Well, then she thought, you know, I haven't seen Johnny for a little while. I better go check on him. So she went out the back door and across the porch and down the steps, and she started to call, Johnny, Johnny, come see Mommy. But there was no answering little voice. Mother, she thought, he's just playing in or under something. So she went around peeking under all the bushes, looking inside the doghouse, looking under the porch, looking everywhere. But there was no little Johnny. She was concerned. Where was Johnny? Finally, she got so concerned, she ran out the back gate, slamming it behind her, and ran toward the barn calling, John, John, Johnny's gone, Johnny's gone. Well, John came running out, and he reached out and he grabbed his wife, stopping her right in front of him and said, Johnny's gone? Where was he? He was playing in the backyard, inside the fence, and I was canning peaches. I kept looking and he was fine. And then all of a sudden he was just gone. Well, Dad said, I'll come look. So he came inside the yard and he looked everywhere, but there was no Johnny. Then, while he was standing there, he looked up at that cornfield that seemed to stretch forever in the distance. Could little Johnny have gone in the cornfield and gotten lost? And there wasn't much time left in this afternoon. And he turned to Mother and he said, Go in the house and call all the neighbors. Ask them to come help us look for Johnny. So Mother did. She ran in the house. She went in the living room. And it was 1939. And a 1939 phone isn't like our little cell phones. No, it was a landline with a cord that plugged into the wall. It had a receiver on it. You'd pick up the receiver and put it to your ear. And on top of the phone was a round circle with holes in it, with the numbers written under it. And when you wanted to dial a number, you would go 1, 3, 5, 4, 2, 6, whatever the number was. And you had to dial it around that circle, and then it would ring. Well, Mother, she called every one of the neighbors, frantically telling them that Johnny was missing. Would they please come help look? Well, while Mom had been on the phone, Father went out looking around. He'd even looked through the house. He looked toward the barn. He looked there. Little Johnny just wasn't anywhere. Well, by the time Mother had finished all her calls, there was 20-some people standing in the backyard, all anxiously waiting to go look for little Johnny. And Father got them all in a group, and he said, "Now I want you two to go down by the creek. I want you guys to go out by the lake. I want you two to go down by the river and see if you see a little boy there. And the rest of you, I want you to come help me search the cornfield." It'd be easy to lose a 2-year-old in a cornfield. Well, they started out looking. But meanwhile, little Johnny, he had been toddling and playing around that yard, and he had gotten to the gate. And he had seen Mommy push up the little gate thing, and then the gate would open. Well, it's surprising what a 2-year-old can do. He had that gate open in no time, and it was a whole big world in front of him. What should he do? Well, he did see that cornfield, and it was like those rows, the paths between the rows of the corn just beckoned to him. And he started toddling down through the corn, and he would look up. It was tall to a 2-year-old. And he kept going along, and he'd reach out and he'd touch things, and he'd see a butterfly and he would run a little bit. And he had gone quite a ways when little legs get tired, and he'd sat down in the dirt. Well, that was fun too, taking your fingers and playing in the dirt and picking it up and throwing it in the air. Well, while he was sitting down, through the bottoms of the corn, he saw a pheasant. Well, a 2-year-old doesn't know what a pheasant is. It was just a pretty something moving. So, sideways, not going down the rows anymore, through the corn stalks, he pushed his way through, trying to chase after that pheasant. Well, of course, the pheasant wasn't going to stand there, and so it ran off quickly through the corn. Well, Johnny kept seeing things, and he'd go this way for a little while, and then he would go that way. Then he would go down one of the rows, and further he got away from home. Well, afternoons are times when babies take a nap. And Johnny was no exception. He sat down in the middle of the corn, and it was warm, and the ground was warm, and he lay down and went sound asleep. Well, it wasn't too long till his little nap was over, and he looked around, he rubbed his eyes. Where was he? Mommy? Mommy? But there was no mommy. He couldn't see the house. But he got up on his sturdy little legs and he started walking through the corn again, further and further away from home, off across the field, no longer going down those long rows, going across. Went some this way, some that way, some the other way, and pretty soon he came to the edge of the cornfield. But it wasn't the edge where the house was or the edge where the barn was. It was far, far away from all of that. He pushed his way out of those big corn stalks and he looked around. Now, the edge of the cornfield was kind of grassy and nice. He walked through that, and ahead of him, he saw trees, and he saw bushes, and he saw a thicket. You know what a thicket is? A thicket is a bunch of bushes together. And he went inside the thicket. Well, now, back at home, all those 20-some people were frantically walking down the creek, calling, "Johnny! Johnny!" There were others running around the edge of the lake, calling and calling and calling. There were people walking along the edge of the river, but they couldn't see a little boy anywhere. There weren't even any little boy footprints. And the other people that were going through the cornfield, well, some of the time, they thought maybe they saw some little footprints. But you know, it hadn't rained for a while. They all just kept looking and looking and looking. And the sun was getting lower and lower and lower in the sky. Father and Mother had both been looking, and Father told Mother, "You need to go back in the house and wait and watch in case he comes back. You can notify all of us." Well, Father had been going through the corn rows. Finally, he came back to the barnyard, and he thought, maybe if I was up higher, I could see him. So he went in the barn and he got out Molly. Molly was their old farm horse. And he got the saddle on her and he got up in the saddle and then he stopped. Well, you know, before all those people had started looking, they had all prayed to Jesus. "Please help us find little Johnny. Please tell us where to look. Please help us." Well, that had been hours ago. Now, Mother had been praying almost constantly, and Father and all those people had also been praying. But when Father got up on top of Molly in the saddle, he prayed again, and he looked up to heaven, and he said, "God, please show this horse where to go." And he took his hands and he grabbed a hold of the horn on the saddle. And he let go of the reins. And when he opened his eyes, Molly was already starting to canter along. She headed for the creek, and she ran along the edge of the creek for a long, long ways. And then the creek kind of made a loop. But Molly didn't follow the creek anymore. She turned right. She went that way for a while. Then she went left. Then she went straight ahead again. But Father did not touch those reins. Molly obviously was going somewhere. And Father thought, maybe, maybe Molly is being guided by an angel. But he didn't take his hands off of that horn. He did not take his hands off of the horn on that saddle. Molly just kept going. Finally, Molly had come to the far end of that cornfield, and she just kind of went along the end of it. But she kept going. She went through trees, she went through bushes, and finally she stopped dead still, right there. And Father looked around, he couldn't see anything. And then, as if she was being guided again, she started very, very quickly through the bushes, through a big thicket of bushes. And then, ahead of Molly, Father could see little Johnny sitting under the bushes. He would have jumped right off the horse, but Molly started going again, and she went just as close as she could get to little Johnny, close enough that she could have reached out with her nose and touched him. And then she stopped and stood dead still. Well, Father was out of that saddle in no time, and he scooped up his little guy, and he hugged him so close, and running down in the dirt on little Johnny's face were tears. He was probably sad from being gone so long all by himself and not being able to find Mommy or Daddy. Well, Daddy scooped him up and put him on the saddle, and then he climbed up. He grabbed the reins, and as they were galloping toward home, he would set the reins down and he would put his hands up and he would yell, "Found! Found! Found!" Yes, little Johnny was found. And that one word floated across the breeze to all those neighbors looking for little Johnny. And each group that heard it would rush to the next group. He's found, let's go back to the house. Well, by the time John and little Johnny got back to the house, all those people were there, milling around the yard. And when they saw Johnny, there was a cheer went up. And when Johnny saw his mommy, little hands came out, "Mommy, Mommy." And Mommy, of course, grabbed him off the saddle and hugged him, oh, so close to her. And then Johnny said something else. He said, "Mommy, big kitty. Mommy, big kitty. I pet big kitty." You know, 2-year-olds don't say a real lot, but Mama looked they didn't have any kitties, and especially not any big kitties. And all the men in that group had heard, and the ladies were looking concerned. Well, in 1939, in Missouri, there was still a lot of bobcats, and they wandered through the fields and through the kills all around. And the men looked at each other. You know, they could ask Johnny more questions, but it was always the same thing. Big kitty, I pet Big Kitty. And the men all thought, do you suppose, do you suppose that God used a bobcat to take care of little Johnny? Did he do like he did with Daniel in the lion's den and shut the bobcat's mouth so it wouldn't hurt Johnny? Did he whisper in the bobcat's ear that this was a little boy and he was put there to take care of him? I don't know. And you know, we'll never know, because Johnny was too little to remember it when he was big enough to tell them what had really happened out there. But you know, boys and girls, God does use his animals to protect us sometimes. And he does listen. Now, when the father asked God to guide Molly, Molly took right off, because I think an angel or God was whispering in Molly's ear, telling her exactly where to go. Yes, God takes care of us. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.